Welcome everybody to our Zoom into Archaeology weekly series. I recognize a lot of the names who are here today. If you've been with us before, then you know that we are part of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, which is a program of the University of West Florida. And as of right now, although we're not doing any face-to-face meetings, programs, volunteer opportunities, we do still want to get out into our communities as much as possible. And the way we devised to do that was through getting out into our digital community with the Zoom into Archaeology series. So we're hosting these every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. If you follow us on our Facebook page, FPAN Northwest, you've probably seen that we have added a full lineup for July. So we have talks on each Thursday in July, including July 2nd. So go on our Facebook page or on the FPAN website, fpan.us, to check out our lineup for July. We have lots more great talks in July. For now, I want to go ahead and welcome Tristan, who is a public archaeologist with FPAN's North Central region over in Tallahassee. And he is doing a brand new talk for us today. I'm really excited about it. So thank you, Tristan, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic and my camera, and I'm going to let Tristan take over.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. So welcome to the inaugural presentation of Passing Through History, the Tales that Turds Tell. So when archaeologists interact with people who are not archaeologists, one of the common questions we get is, what is the coolest thing you've ever found? And it's a question that archaeologists often have a little trouble answering, not because we haven't found what we think are cool things, but because the expectation of the person asking the question is not at all close to what we think is actually cool. You know, they're expecting beautiful whole pots or treasure chests or crystal skulls or whatever. And in reality, archaeology is not about the things we find so much as the things we find are really just a means to discovering the stories. So we are actually doing archaeology and finding those things because of the stories they tell. And so it can be hard to explain to someone that this really uninteresting thing, or you might think is uninteresting, is actually really fascinating. And so what better way of illustrating that than one of the possibly grossest and ugliest things that we can find on a site. It also happens to be one of the coolest because of the information they often include and the information they contain. And there we go. So before I really go in, though, I want to kind of define what we're talking about. There's several different categories of it. You can split up even more, but there's a couple key things to keep in mind. One is what people call coprolite, and so this is actually fossilized. And of course, fossilization process means there is no organic matter left. It is entirely stone at this point. Now, coprolite, when people talk about coprolites, they don't always mean fossilized. So it's something, if you ever read about it, something to keep in mind. Sometimes they're actually talking about just very old. But generally speaking, coprolite means fossilized. So fossilized objects, the official cutoff is about 10,000 years. However, in reality, it's not that clean. Actually, in right conditions, it can fossilize much more quickly or take a lot longer, depending on what it is. And then fossilization isn't something that, you snap your fingers and it's done. It's a very long process. So, so something to keep in mind when we talk about it. Most of what I'm going to talk about today applies to coprolites, but it's not necessarily everything applies to coprolites. Another thing to keep in mind about coprolites is there's an awful lot you can see about dino dung, which is a lot of fun. There's a place called the Museum, which is referenced down at the bottom, that tends to focus a lot on that. And the thing about dino dung is that archaeologists are not actually interested in it. The thing about archaeology is it's about the study of people in the past based on the things they left behind. So dinosaurs, there were no people, so archaeologists aren't interested. Even to use another example, if we find a mammoth skeleton and it died in a tar pit or naturally or something, then again, we're not interested in it. But if that mammoth were to have butcher marks on its bone from people butchering it, then archaeologists are involved. So if it's not archaeology in those situations, that would be paleontologists doing the research on the fossils, just so you kind of understand the difference in what archaeology's focus really is. A lot of what we're going to be referencing and talking about today can kind of fall under the fresh category, and it's not quite what you might imagine with that. You know, when you're talking about 3,000-year-old piece of poop, it's not necessarily the gross thing you're imagining. Although there are potentially exceptions of that. Generally speaking, though, it's you know, all dried out. It's not quite what you might expect. Like I said, there are exceptions. I was on a site one time. It was a remote homestead that we had been told was abandoned in the 30s, and we found the outhouse, which is great. Lots of good information from here, not just from the poop, but from other things people have thrown away in there. And it turns out, we kind of concluded later that that outhouse had been used maybe up through the 50s and 60s by hunters, because it was not as old as it should be, and it was kind of unfortunate. But that is the exception to the rule by and large. So you can probably break this down a bit more. Like people will talk about paleofeces, and by that they mean prehistoric, so pre-written record. So just kind of keep that in mind. There are some terms out there that can help you out if you're ever investigating this stuff. So what can we learn from it, though? So, you know, why is this so interesting? Well, there's a bunch of things. One of it is dating. We can get, if it's not fossilized, we can potentially get carbon dating from it. If it is fossilized, there's other techniques like thermoluminescence that can work on stone. It kind of works similar to carbon dating as well. And you might say, well, yeah, you can get it from bone or other sources too. Why do you need to get it from this source? Why is ancient feces a good source for this? But the thing you also have to remember about archaeology is, like a lot of other science, or even like criminal science, we don't just take one piece of evidence and Sherlock Holmes it and say, aha, this is what it means. We want to find lots of different pieces of evidence and see if they fit together. And if they do, that tells us we're on the right track. But if we have conflicts, then that tells us something might be different than we might expect. So having more avenues for the same kind of evidence is really a good thing. So dating is a good thing. The image on the right there, that is actually Willard Libby, the chemist who proposed and demonstrated carbon dating. I just thought that was a nice photo. So related to the date, also, we can get time of year. And that's important because some places people were living seasonally. They weren't there year round. We can look at what kinds of plants, kinds of animals are present, what pollens are present, that kind of thing, and know what time of year people were there. And that's really good information. And kind of related to all that is the environment. We think of the prehistoric environment being like it is today, generally speaking, but that wasn't necessarily the case at all. During the Ice Age, Florida was a lot more temperate than it is now. I grew up in the Midwest, and in various points in prehistory, that was a desert. It wasn't like, you know, Sahara level desert, but it was very dry, very arid climate. Not quite what we have today. So this is a good way we can get at that, is to what kinds of plants were present, because plants are very sensitive. Animals as well. Kind of related to all that too is diet. Now this is another thing that's kind of interesting to point out, is a lot of our evidence about diet, or in archaeology in general, is what's called indirect evidence. So if we find a bunch of corn cobs and corn kernels in the bottom of a fire pit, we might conclude people were eating corn. But that isn't necessarily the only possible outcome of that, right? So, but if we find it in a piece of ancient feces, then there's no doubt that somebody consumed this. Even then, though, it doesn't mean that it's a part of their regular diet. There's other explanations for how it could be there, such as it was medicine, religious purposes, or entertainment purposes. And then, of course, we have to keep in mind cases of accidental consumption. I read one report where they found a tick, and they They think that it was ingested intentionally because it wasn't ground up like it had been in grain. But I think there's probably other ways a tick could get into, someone could accidentally swallow a tick. So there are, and this is also the evidence of that, is that this is the only example we have of a tick in ancient feces. So really, that's a case where we probably need more evidence to say for sure if this was a habitual thing or not. Related to diet too are the food technologies involved. So things like processing seeds. Are they pounding it? Are they rolling it? Are they grinding things? Acorns, some acorns, for example, have to be boiled before they can be eaten, otherwise they're toxic. Collection techniques, I'll have an interesting example of that later. And then other cooking technologies, like some foods need a specific kind of oven to be able to do well, or pit hearths, and knowing how to build and maintain them so that they are effectively cook your food. That's all technology that we can start to get at based on what they are eating and how they're cooking it in some ways. One of the ways they tell what kinds of things are in the diet is what's called an odorgram, which I pictured, some scientist rehydrating and giving it a sniff, but that's not it at all. It's actually just what they're doing is actually testing the chemical gases involved, and that's actually really good too, because you might be able to see remains of corn and stuff in ancient feces, but some things you won't be able to see, but it might change the smell. For the example I've seen given, and it's a great example, is tea. You don't eat the tea leaves, and in our area specifically, that's kind of important because there's the consumption of black drink, and how is black drink going to show up? And there's one way that we might see that. So again, there's a lot going on here, a lot of potential for learning from this stuff. So these horrifying images are actually electron microscopes of tapeworms. So health is another thing we can get at through ancient feces. Parasites, of course, are very typically present and give you an idea of how healthy people are or how healthy they are not. We can also get at, the diet. Is the diet varied? Is it very limited? That kind of thing will give us some clues. There's even some cases where they've actually managed to study bacteria that was present, and they've even tried to work on some viruses, which hasn't apparently worked yet, and that's probably okay, especially this year. I don't need an ancient virus running around. But also imagine the potential, what we could learn from that. If a society is being hit by an epidemic, how did they adapt? What kind of steps did they take? There's a lot we can get from that kind of information. So that's potentially very exciting as well. And so also, and last example of the kinds of things we can learn is DNA. Again, you might think, well, we can get DNA from other sources. Why do we need to get it from poop? There's a couple of reasons for that. Like I said, multiple avenues is better. Also, actually, it turns out DNA from bones is not near the quality it can be from ancient feces. So there's actually good quality DNA in there. And then also you have to keep in mind that there are a lot of very good and necessary laws regulating how ancient human remains are treated, especially when we're dealing with remains that have living ancestors. And people very understandably may not want archaeologists cutting out little chunks of their ancestors' bones to test it for DNA. But nobody cares about poop. We can test that to our heart's content. So that's fantastic. So there's a whole sampling of the kinds of things that we can learn from it. So the rest of it I'm going to cover is examples of what actually, some case studies, I guess, some stories of what we've learned from some specific examples. And so first up is this, probably one of the more famous ones out there. So this is actually called the Lloyd's Bank turd, and that is the actual official name of it. It was found in York, England, which kind of gives you an idea about, maybe the sense of humor of the archaeologist who named it. It's called Lloyd's Bank because it was actually found in an excavation associated with a bank that was called Lloyd's Bank. I don't know what they feel about having this thing named after them or not, but I find it like a funny story anyway. So to give you some context, this is dated to 1,100 years old. It's suspected to have belonged to a Viking. And give you some perspective here, it is 8 inches long, 2 inches wide, and weighs half a pound. And so, ouch, basically. This is not, someone was not comfortable. And you start to wonder, like, well, how did this even happen? And so they tested it, and they found it is made almost entirely of meat and bread. So that tells you a bit of the problem there. And also, it is just packed with parasites, specifically whipworms and giant roundworms. And both of those parasites are parasites that are spread through basically sewage issues, or lack of sewage in this case. So essentially, fecal matter gets into the food system and gets consumed, and that's how people get the parasites. So it's gross, but think about what that tells us. It gives an idea about what the sanitation was like. But not only that, what their understanding of sanitation was like, and what their understanding about parasites were, because they apparently didn't have much concept that parasites could be spread this way. So there's a fair amount of information in that. So another interesting example is the Paisley Caves site. To give a little more context to this, I think a lot of folks are aware of the ice corridor for how people first came to North America. Essentially, during the Ice Age, there was a corridor in the ice that opened up. Animals migrated across that ice, and people followed the animals across into North America. The first group of people is called Clovis. For the last 30 years or so, there's been a bunch of archaeologists or not a bunch, but there have been archaeologists who think that there is evidence of a pre-Clovis people, so people here before that, which would be interesting because it opens up questions about how people got here. It's a fascinating idea. But so far, the evidence has generally been lacking. And the common thing you'll hear in science in general is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so far, we just don't have the evidence to really say, yeah, we think this is the case. Along comes the Paisley Caves excavation, and they found some ancient feces that dated to 14,300 years old, which is significantly before the Clovis people we think they first came to North America. That's exciting. And so basically this was held up as, it's been proven people were here beforehand, and it's kind of was all over. I think it was in Science magazine and stuff. Unfortunately, it is most certainly not proven. While this is adding to the evidence, this is certainly not, and there's my cat. This is adding to, there's my cat jumping off the table. This adds to the evidence, but it's definitely not the smoking gun that people are looking for ultimately. So there's some problems with it, and I won't go into all the details, but kind of summarize some of the problems. Is when they tested this, they found evidence of both human and canine DNA. So the argument could be the canine DNA leaked down from a higher level, but that reverse could also work. The human could have leaked down as well. But the big thing is, and the big thing that's the common problem with these, with the evidence, most of the pre-Clovis evidence is the evidence found is usually very isolated. So in the case of these paleofeces, nothing else dated to that time period. There's some things that have a range that could be older, but it also could be solidly in the Clovis. So because we have nothing else associated with them, it's really not a strong evidence, because we should be able to find the little stone chips, pieces of butchered bone, or something else to give us evidence. And that has overall been the problem. Like, people, they'll find a point, and this point dates to a point time that's too old, but there's nothing else with it. Or here's a fire pit, but there's nothing else with it. So essentially, the way science works is, until we have evidence that yes, there definitely were people here before the Clovis group, there weren't. And we're ready to change that if the evidence does show up. But for as of right now, there were no pre-Clovis. That's kind of how it works in general. But something to keep an eye out, because if with people looking, you can never tell what'll turn up, and it may not ever happen, and that's okay. It's how it's supposed to work. But Paisley Caves was a part of this whole interesting scientific process. Another case, and this is an excellent example of why archaeology matters today. So if you are aware of the ancient Puebloan people in the southwest Colorado, Four Corners region down there, these were a group of people who lived in a very arid climate, and actually they're the ones that built the cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde. If you haven't heard about it or visited, I highly recommend it. It is staggering what they accomplished in the ability to live in this climate. So a few years ago, at a site called Cowboy Wash, right in southwest Colorado, there is a site where there was a case of cannibalism, and there is no question that it was cannibalism. I won't go into all the gory details, because that's not what this is about, but the most relevant for our talk today is that there was some ancient poop found that was like, yeah, this person ate a person. There is no other way around it. And so before this, there was kind of a portrayal of ancient Puebloans as these kind of peace-loving hippies, in tune with their environment and everything. And now or with this discovery, some of that perspective has shifted to they're bloodthirsty cannibals, and probably human sacrifices were in there or something, I don't know. And really, to be clear, neither perspective is fair. This was a complex group of people, and like almost all groups, there was a pretty typical level of violence. So really, neither perspective is fair, but the new kind of bloodthirsty perspective was really almost became an attack on the living descendants of Puebloans, on people who are alive today. And that is a big problem, especially because people who actually spend a lot of time studying ancient feces in this area, and there is a lot of examples from this area because of the dry climate specifically, they said that it's almost certainly is not Puebloan, even though it's in the area and it's in that time period. A couple of big reasons why they think is actually it was not from this culture was, first of all, every single example of ancient feces from this culture has a lot of variety and a lot of variety of plant material. And whoever the cannibal was, there was zero plant material in there. So that just doesn't fit what we understand of the culture. And there's no other examples of this in that culture. So that's a big problem. And also the arguments that maybe it was extreme conditions don't really hold up well, because we know that this culture went through extreme conditions. They went through a 50 or 60-year-old drought, and no indication of cannibalism happening. Actually, we can fascinatingly see their diets adapt to fit these conditions. The types of foods they were eating changed so that they could keep surviving in this really harsh climate. So that's just a good example of how much we can learn from it, but also the potential for archaeology to cause problems and ultimately try and fix them. Archaeology is relevant, I guess, is the moral of the story here. So to lighten it up a little bit, this is something I thought was fascinating, was There's a site in Texas, southwest Texas, where they found coprolites from this specific group that has lots of fish in it. And specifically, lots of teeny tiny fish, fish that is too small to be caught with a hook or a net. So the question is like, well, how were they collecting all these tiny little fish? And also at these same sites, they have found a ton of what's called Mexican buckeye seeds. And this is interesting because they don't show up in the paleo feces at all, but also they are toxic. They're poisonous. What are they even doing here, especially in these large numbers? Well, through what we call experimental archaeology, which is essentially trying things out and seeing if this could have been done in certain ways, they actually figured out that if you grind up these seeds into a powder and throw it into the ponds, it's actually a very potent fish poison. And I think that's fascinating because we talk about food gathering technologies and processing technologies, and here's a pretty complex system that these folks had worked out. Now, what are the long-term effects of eating these fish that have been poisoned? I don't know that we know. I don't know that we know there's any evidence of that, but I just thought it was a fascinating example of human ingenuity that we wouldn't know about if it wasn't for poop. And so for the last thing I'm going to talk about today, this is the last example. This is the Gougeon dog turd, and I like to call it that because Remy Gougeon is the archaeologist who was leading the site who found it, and I like to think he could be a little amused and horrified that I've unofficially named it after him. So this is a 500-year-old dog turd, and the thing you have to know about the image right here is this is not it. This is a poop stand-in for our talk today, because it was so incredibly unimpressive that the photo is just not worth showing. But like the point I've been trying to make is it's not about how pretty the thing is, it's about the story it tells. So we tested it, and we found pieces of fish skull on there. So we know what kinds of fish the dog and the people were eating 500 years ago. We found bits of charcoal and sand, so the dog was probably scrounging around in cold campfires like a dog would do. But my favorite thing is we tested it for pollen. And because plants pollinate at different times of the year, we know that this dog pooped in the springtime 500 years ago. And that's actually really important information because I think, like I said earlier, some sites are seasonal. People are only there for certain times of the year, and we know now that people were there at very least in the springtime. And that's a lot of information from an ugly, gross little thing that's not even worth a photo. But then you think about, too, that's not all we have from that site. We have hundreds or thousands of other artifacts from that site. We have pit features, we have hearths, we have garbage piles, we have post holes that tells us how people lived, what they ate, what their family structures are like, what their trade networks are like. And these archaeology is the only way we can get at these stories anymore. And that's what it's all about. And that is why the ugliest, probably grossest thing we could possibly find on an archaeological site is also the coolest. So that is all I've got. Are there any questions or anything? I see people are having fun in the chat. I had fun writing this too, so fair game.